Sophie trudged up the stairs to her small apartment, her body aching from another exhausting day at work. The weight of her bag seemed to increase with each step, a physical manifestation of the mental fatigue that had become her constant companion. As she reached her floor, she fumbled with her keys, the jingle echoing in the empty hallway. "Buddy," she called out as she pushed open the door, expecting to hear the familiar patter of paws rushing to greet her. The silence that answered was unusual and unsettling. "Buddy, where are you, boy?" Sophie's voice held a note of concern as she dropped her bag and walked further into the apartment. Her eyes scanned the small living room, seeing no sign of her beloved dog. A knot of worry began to form in her stomach as she made her way to the kitchen. The sight that greeted her made her heart stop. Buddy lay motionless on the kitchen floor, his chest barely rising with shallow breaths. Sophie's world narrowed to that single, terrifying image. "Buddy," she cried, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands shook as she reached out to touch his fur, feeling the warmth of his body, but getting no response. "Oh God, buddy, please wake up!" Panic set in as Sophie realized the severity of the situation. She scrambled for her phone, her fingers trembling as she searched for nearby veterinary clinics. The first two she called were closed, and she felt tears of frustration welling up in her eyes. "Please, please, someone be open," she muttered, dialing the third number on her list. "Central City Veterinary Hospital. How can I help you?" A calm voice answered. "My dog. He's unconscious. I don't know what's wrong. Please, can I bring him in?" Sophie's voice cracked with emotion. "Yes, bring him in immediately. We're open 24/7 for emergencies." Sophie didn't even bother to end the call properly. She scooped Buddy into her arms, his limp form a dead weight against her chest. Adrenaline surged through her as she raced down the stairs, taking them two at a time, her only thought getting Buddy the help he needed. Out on the street, Sophie frantically waved at passing cars, praying for a taxi. "Please stop. It's an emergency," she yelled, her voice raw with desperation. Finally, a yellow cab screeched to a halt in front of her. The driver's eyes widened as he took in the scene, a disheveled woman cradling a large, unconscious dog. "Please," Sophie begged, "I need to get to Central City Veterinary Hospital. It's an emergency." The driver hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Get in quickly." Sophie climbed into the back seat, still holding Buddy close. "Hurry, please," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper as she stroked Buddy's fur. The taxi weaved through the evening traffic, the driver sensing the urgency of the situation. Sophie's mind raced, replaying the day, wondering if she had missed any signs that Buddy was unwell. The guilt and fear threatened to overwhelm her. As they pulled up to the hospital, Sophie didn't wait for the cab to come to a full stop. She thrust some bills at the driver, mumbling a quick thanks before bursting out of the car, Buddy still in her arms. She ran through the automatic doors, her eyes wild with panic. "Help! Please, someone help my dog!" A young veterinarian with kind eyes and tousled hair rushed forward. "I'm Dr. Max Carter. What happened?" "I don't know," Sophie gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "I found him like this when I got home from work. He won't wake up." Dr. Carter quickly assessed Buddy, his face growing serious. "Let's get him to the exam room right away." "Follow me." Sophie trailed behind as Dr. Carter and a nurse whisked Buddy away on a gurney. She found herself ushered into a sterile waiting room, the sudden quiet a stark contrast to the frantic energy of moments before. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Sophie waited, her mind conjuring worst-case scenarios. She paced the small room, alternating between silent prayers and quiet sobs. Finally, after what felt like hours, Dr. Carter returned. The grave expression on his face made Sophie's heart sink. "Miss Thompson," he began gently, "Buddy is stable for now, but I'm afraid the news isn't good. He's suffering from a severe heart condition that requires immediate surgery." Sophie felt the room spin. "Surgery? But he's never had any health problems before." Dr. Carter nodded sympathetically. "Sometimes these conditions can develop suddenly or go unnoticed until they become critical. In Buddy's case, we need to act fast. The surgery he needs is complex and expensive." Sophie steeled herself. "How much?" Dr. Carter hesitated before answering. The procedure, including aftercare, will cost approximately $15,000. The number hit Sophie like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face as the reality of the situation sank in. Her mind raced through her finances, her meager savings, her maxed-out credit cards, the stack of unpaid bills waiting at home. There was no way she could afford this. I don't have that kind of money," she whispered, her voice breaking. Tears began to fall freely now, the weight of her helplessness crushing down on her. Dr. Carter watched her with a mix of compassion and concern, clearly torn between his professional duties and his desire to help. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes pleading and filled with tears. "What happens if I can't pay?" Sophie's desperate question hung in the air, her tear-filled eyes fixed on Max. The young veterinarian hesitated, glancing down the corridor to ensure they were alone. With a deep breath, he gently took Sophie's arm and guided her into a private consultation room. "Look, Sophie," Max began, his voice low and serious. "I need to be honest with you. The hospital has very strict policies about payment for procedures, especially ones as costly as Buddy's surgery." Sophie's shoulders slumped as she sank into a chair. "I understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know what I'm going to do. Buddy is all I have." Seeing her distress, Max felt a twinge in his chest. He leaned against the desk, crossing his arms as he studied the distraught woman before him. "Tell me about Buddy," he said softly. "How long have you had him?" Sophie looked up, a faint smile tugging at her lips despite her worry. "I found him on the streets about 3 years ago," she began, her eyes taking on a distant look as she recalled the memory. The room faded away as Sophie's mind transported her back to that rainy night. She had been walking home from a late shift, huddled under her umbrella, when she heard a pitiful whimper coming from an alley. There, shivering and soaked to the bone, was a scruffy golden retriever mix. His ribs were visible through his matted fur, and he looked up at her with eyes full of fear and hope. "I couldn't just leave him there," Sophie continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I took him home, cleaned him up, and nursed him back to health. From that day on, we've been inseparable. He's not just a pet, Dr. Carter. He's my family." Max listened intently, moved by the bond between Sophie and Buddy. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing as he weighed his options. Finally, he made a decision that he knew could have serious repercussions. "Sophie, I'm going to propose something, but you need to understand that this is not standard procedure," Max said, leaning in closer. "I can set up an alternative payment plan for you. We'll start Buddy's treatment immediately, and you can pay in installments over time." Sophie's eyes widened in disbelief. You can do that?" she asked, hope creeping into her voice for the first time since she'd arrived at the hospital. Max nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's not exactly by the book, but I believe in doing what's right. Buddy deserves a chance, and you deserve to have your family member by your side." Overcome with gratitude, Sophie leapt from her chair and threw her arms around Max in a spontaneous hug. "Thank you," she sobbed into his shoulder. "Thank you so much." Max, momentarily stunned by the embrace, awkwardly patted her back. "It's okay," he murmured. "We'll get Buddy the help he needs." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Dr. Foster, the senior veterinarian, stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. Sophie quickly stepped back from Max, wiping her eyes. "Dr. Carter, a word, please," Dr. Foster said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Max nodded, giving Sophie a reassuring smile before following Dr. Foster into the hallway. The tension between the two men was palpable as they moved out of earshot. Sophie watched anxiously through the room's window as Dr. Foster spoke animatedly to Max, his gestures sharp and agitated. She couldn't hear their words, but the gravity of the situation was clear on both men's faces. "Max, do you have any idea what you're doing?" Dr. Foster hissed, keeping his voice low but intense. "Offering unauthorized payment plans could jeopardize your position here, not to mention open up the hospital to liability issues." Max stood his ground, meeting the older doctor's gaze steadily. "I understand the risks, Dr. Foster, but I also understand our duty as healers. We can't turn our backs on patients, human or animal. just because of financial constraints. Dr. Foster pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling slowly. Your compassion is admirable, Max, but it could also be your downfall in this profession. Be careful. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. With that ominous warning, Dr. Foster strode away, leaving Max to contemplate the potential consequences of his actions. After a moment, he returned to the consultation room where Sophie waited anxiously. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Max forced a smile. "Everything's fine. Let's get those papers signed so we can start Buddy's treatment, shall we?" Relief washed over Sophie's face as she nodded eagerly. Max retrieved the necessary forms, explaining each one as Sophie signed. With each signature, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. As they finished the paperwork, a nurse appeared at the door. "Dr. Carter, we're ready to begin Buddy's initial treatment." Sophie stood, her hands clasped tightly together. "Can I see him before you start?" Max nodded, leading her to where Buddy was being prepared. The dog's tail wagged weakly at the sight of his owner, and Sophie bent to press a gentle kiss to his forehead. "You're going to be okay, boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "These good people are going to take care of you." As Buddy was wheeled away for his treatment, Sophie turned to Max, her eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, Dr. Carter." Max smiled warmly. "Just focus on Buddy getting better. That's all the thanks I need." As Sophie watched Buddy disappear down the hallway, Dr. Foster's voice came from behind them, low and ominous. "You have no idea what you've just set in motion." Sophie sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of unpaid bills. The dim light from the overhead fixture cast long shadows across the room, mirroring the dark thoughts creeping into her mind. She picked up her phone, took a deep breath, and began dialing. "Hey, Mom," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I know it's been a while, but I need to ask you something." The conversation was brief and disappointing. Sophie hung up and crossed another name off her list. She had already called her sister, her best friend from college, and even her estranged father. Each call ended the same way: sympathetic words but no substantial help. Meanwhile, at the veterinary hospital, Dr. Max Carter was checking on Buddy. The dog's condition had improved slightly, but Max knew they were far from out of the woods. He gently stroked Buddy's fur, whispering words of encouragement. The sound of footsteps made Max look up. Sophie stood in the doorway, a small, well-worn stuffed toy in her hands. "I thought maybe this would help," she said softly, approaching the bed. "It's his favorite." Max smiled, taking the toy and placing it near Buddy's paw. "That's very thoughtful. How are you holding up?" Sophie's brave facade crumbled slightly. "I'm managing. I've been trying to scrape together some money, but it's not easy." She hesitated, then added, "I might lose my job over this. My boss isn't happy about all the time I'm taking off." Max opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Buddy's body suddenly went rigid. The dog's legs began to twitch violently, and a horrible choking sound filled the room. "He's seizing," Max shouted, immediately springing into action. "I need help in here now." Sophie stumbled backward, her hands covering her mouth in horror as a team of nurses rushed into the room. She watched helplessly as they worked to stabilize Buddy, their urgent voices blending into a cacophony of medical jargon she couldn't understand. A gentle hand on her arm made her jump. An older nurse with kind eyes was guiding her out of the room. "Let's give them some space to work, dear," she said softly, leading Sophie to the waiting area. The minutes crawled by like hours. Sophie paced the small room, alternating between silent prayers and quiet sobs. Finally, Max emerged, looking exhausted but determined. "We've stabilized him," he said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "But this episode proves we can't wait any longer. I'm going to start the preliminary treatment for the surgery." Sophie's eyes widened. "But the money?" "I haven't." Max held up a hand. "We'll figure it out. Right now, Buddy needs this to survive." As Max turned to leave, a commotion at the front desk caught their attention. A tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit was striding purposefully towards them, his face a mask of barely contained anger. "That's my father," Max muttered, his expression darkening. "Richard Carter, the owner of this hospital. Richard's voice boomed across the waiting room. Maxwell, my office now. Sophie watched as Max followed his father, the tension between them palpable. She couldn't hear their words, but the raised voices carried through the closed door. Phrases like unauthorized treatment and violation of hospital policy reached her ears, making her stomach churn with guilt. The argument seemed to reach a crescendo, and suddenly the door flew open. Richard's face was flushed with anger as he pointed a finger at his son. This ends now, Max. If you continue with this treatment, you're fired. Do you understand me? A heavy silence fell over the hospital. Staff members pretended to be occupied with their tasks, but all eyes were surreptitiously fixed on the unfolding drama. Sophie felt sick, knowing she was the cause of this rift between father and son. Max stood tall, his jaw set in defiance. He glanced over at Sophie, then at Buddy's room, before turning back to face his father. His voice was calm, but filled with resolve as he spoke the words that would change everything. Do whatever you want with me, but I won't let Buddy die. Sophie's fingers hovered over her phone's keyboard, her heart racing as she contemplated her next move. The weight of Buddy's medical bills pressed heavily on her shoulders, and she knew she needed to act fast. With a deep breath, she dialed Brianna's number. Bree, I need your help, Sophie said, her voice trembling slightly. I'm thinking of starting an online fundraising campaign for Buddy. Do you think you could help me set it up? Brianna's enthusiastic response was immediate. Of course, I'll be right over. We'll make this happen, sophomore. Within an hour, Brianna arrived at Sophie's apartment, laptop in tow. The two friends huddled over the computer, crafting a compelling narrative for Buddy's page. Sophie's eyes welled up as she described Buddy's condition and the urgent need for funds. This has to work, Sophie whispered, more to herself than to Brianna. As they worked on the campaign across town, Max was arriving at the veterinary hospital. The moment he stepped through the doors, he sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Colleagues who usually greeted him warmly now averted their gaze or offered only curt nods. The weight of his decision to help Sophie and Buddy was palpable in every interaction. Pushing aside the discomfort, Max made his way to Buddy's room. He found Sophie already there, her eyes widening at the sight of new equipment surrounding her beloved dog. Max, she began hesitantly, all these new machines? I'm worried about the additional costs. Are these necessary? Max's heart sank. He knew every piece of equipment was crucial for Buddy's care, but he also understood Sophie's financial concerns. They're important for monitoring Buddy's condition, he explained gently. But don't worry about the cost right now. Let's focus on getting him better. As they spoke, Sophie's phone buzzed. It was Brianna, excitedly announcing that the fundraising page was live and the first donations were trickling in. A glimmer of hope flickered in Sophie's eyes. It's working, she breathed, showing Max the notification. People are actually donating. Their moment of celebration was short-lived as a nurse appeared at the door, her expression grave. Dr. Carter, the hospital board is requesting your presence immediately. Max's stomach dropped. He knew this meeting was coming, but he had hoped for more time. With a reassuring nod to Sophie, he followed the nurse out of the room. As Max disappeared down the hallway, Sophie's phone rang again. This time it was her workplace. The voice on the other end was stern, warning her about her recent absences. Sophie listened, her heart sinking with each word, knowing her job was hanging by a thread. Dr. Foster chose that moment to enter Buddy's room, his face etched with concern. Ms. Chun, I need to speak with you about Buddy's case, he began, his tone serious. I'm afraid it's more complex than we initially thought. We may need to bring in a specialist. Sophie's mind reeled. A specialist meant more expenses, more complications. She nodded numbly, trying to process this new information. Meanwhile, in the boardroom, Max faced a barrage of questions and accusations. The tension was palpable as he defended his actions, arguing passionately for compassion in their medical practice. But as he left the meeting, the weight of potential consequences hung heavily on his shoulders. Back in Buddy's room, Sophie and Max reconvened, both visibly shaken by their recent encounters. They shared a moment of vulnerability, their eyes meeting in silent understanding of the challenges they faced. As they stood there, Sophie's phone buzzed once more. It was Brianna again, this time with troubling news. "Sophie, we've got a problem." Brianna's voice crackled through the speaker. "Some trolls are questioning the legitimacy of our campaign. They're leaving nasty comments, and it's scaring away potential donors." Sophie's heart sank. She looked at Buddy, peacefully sleeping amidst the beeping machines, and felt a renewed surge of determination. No matter what obstacles arose, she wouldn't give up on him. As Sophie watched Buddy sleeping, her phone vibrated with a message from work. "We need to talk about your situation." Sophie's heart raced as she approached her workplace, the weight of the impending conversation with her boss hanging heavily on her shoulders. She had been dreading this moment since receiving the ominous message the night before. As she pushed open the office door, her supervisor's stern gaze met her immediately. "Sophie, we need to talk about your recent absences," her boss began, gesturing for her to take a seat. "I understand you're going through a difficult time, but we have a business to run." Sophie nodded, her throat tight as she tried to explain. "I know, and I'm sorry. It's just that my dog, Buddy, he's very sick and—" "I sympathize, really," her boss interrupted, "but your work has been suffering. We've had to redistribute your tasks to other team members, and it's causing strain on everyone." The conversation continued, growing increasingly tense as Sophie realized the precariousness of her position. By the time she left her boss's office, the message was clear: shape up or ship out. The threat of unemployment loomed large, adding another layer of stress to her already overwhelming situation. Meanwhile, across town at the veterinary hospital, Max was facing his own set of challenges. His father, Richard, had cornered him in an empty exam room, his face a mask of disappointment and frustration. "Max, this has gone on long enough," Richard said, his voice low but firm. "I've been patient, but you're jeopardizing everything we've built here. If you continue down this path, I'll have no choice but to reconsider your position in the family business and your inheritance." Max felt a chill run through him at his father's words. He knew Richard wasn't bluffing. The threat was very real. But as he thought of Buddy and the promise he'd made to Sophie, he squared his shoulders. "Dad, I understand your position, but I can't just abandon a patient in need. There has to be a way we can help without compromising our ethics or the hospital's finances." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You're not seeing the bigger picture, son. This isn't just about one dog. It's about setting precedents and running a sustainable business." As father and son continued their heated discussion, Sophie returned to the hospital, trying to push aside her work troubles to focus on Buddy. She found her friend Brianna waiting for her, tablet in hand, a worried expression on her face. "Sophie, we've got a problem," Brianna said, showing her the screen. "Look at these comments on the fundraising page." Sophie's heart sank as she scrolled through a series of negative posts questioning the legitimacy of Buddy's case and accusing them of running a scam. "This can't be happening," she murmured, feeling the fragile hope she'd been clinging to start to crumble. As if on cue, Dr. Foster approached them, his face grave. "Sophie, I need to speak with you about Buddy's condition," he said, leading her to a quiet corner. "I'm afraid the case is more complex than we initially thought. We're going to need a specialist, and their fees, well, they're not insignificant." Sophie listened in stunned silence as Dr. Foster outlined the new complications and costs. Each word felt like another weight being added to her already overburdened shoulders. How could she possibly manage this when she was on the verge of losing her job? As Sophie tried to process this new information, Max emerged from his confrontation with his father, looking shaken. He spotted Sophie and made his way over, immediately sensing her distress. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern etched on his face. Sophie couldn't hold back anymore. The tears she'd been fighting all day finally spilled over as she recounted her conversation with her boss, the issues with the fundraising campaign, and Dr. Foster's latest update. Max listened, his own troubles momentarily forgotten as he focused on comforting Sophie. "We'll figure this out," he assured her, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "There has to be a way." As they stood there, both feeling the weight of their respective challenges, Brianna approached again, this time with a spark of determination in her eyes. "Guys, I have an idea. We need to change our strategy with the fundraising. What if we—" Their impromptu strategy session was abruptly interrupted by a sharp, insistent beeping from Buddy's room. All three of them froze for a split second before rushing towards the sound, their hearts in their throats. Inside, they found a nurse already attending to Buddy, adjusting his four and checking his vitals. His blood pressure dropped suddenly, she explained as Dr. Foster hurried in. We're stabilizing him now, but this is a sign his condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. Sophie watched helplessly as the medical team worked on Buddy, her mind racing with fears and possibilities. She felt Max's hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support, but it did little to quell the rising panic in her chest. As the immediate crisis passed and Buddy's monitors returned to a more normal rhythm, Sophie turned to Max, her voice barely above a whisper. How much time do we have left? Sophie's heart raced as Max delivered the news she had been dreading. We have 48 hours, Sophie. After that, Buddy's chances. His voice trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. Sophie nodded, her jaw set with determination. There was no time for despair. They had to act fast. Immediately, Sophie and Brianna huddled together, their fingers flying across their phones as they intensified their efforts on the online campaign. They reached out to every contact, every group, and every platform they could think of. Brianna's social media expertise came in handy as she crafted compelling posts and stories, showcasing Buddy's journey and the urgent need for help. Meanwhile, Max was fighting his own battle within the hospital walls. He knew the standard medications were stretching Sophie's already strained budget to the breaking point. In a moment of compassion, or perhaps recklessness, he made a decision. Slipping into the hospital's pharmacy, Max carefully selected several vials of Buddy's prescribed medications, marking them down as discounted on the records. As Sophie made desperate phone calls to potential donors, her voice cracking with emotion, she was unaware of the storm brewing just a few doors down. Richard, Max's father and the hospital owner, burst into the pharmacy, his face contorted with anger. What the hell do you think you're doing? Richard's voice boomed, causing Max to flinch. Dad, I can explain, Max started, but Richard cut him off. Explain? Explain how you're jeopardizing this hospital's reputation? How you're risking our licenses? Richard's words were like daggers, each one hitting its mark. Their argument escalated, voices rising until they echoed through the corridors. Sophie, returning from a quick visit to Buddy, heard the commotion. She froze outside the pharmacy, her heart sinking as she realized she was the cause of this conflict. You're suspended, Max, effective immediately. Richard's voice rang out, clear and final. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. She backed away, guilt washing over her in waves. She had never meant for things to go this far, for Max to risk so much for her and Buddy. Back in the waiting area, Brianna approached Sophie with a mix of hope and hesitation on her face. We've hit the halfway mark on the fundraiser, she announced, trying to inject some positivity into the situation. Sophie nodded, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That's good, she said, her voice hollow. Half was better than nothing, but it was still so far from what they needed. As the day wore on, Sophie found herself considering options she never thought she'd have to. She mentally cataloged her possessions, wondering what she could sell. Her grandmother's necklace, her laptop, maybe even her car. Though how she'd get to the hospital then, she wasn't sure. Dr. Foster's appearance in the waiting room pulled Sophie from her desperate calculations. His face was grim as he spoke. I'm concerned about Buddy's condition. He's deteriorating faster than we anticipated. Sophie felt the floor sway beneath her feet. She gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. What does that mean? She asked, dreading the answer. Before Dr. Foster could respond, Max appeared. Despite his suspension, he couldn't stay away, couldn't abandon Sophie and Buddy. It means we need to move fast, he said, his voice low and urgent. I may not be able to treat Buddy directly anymore, but I can still advise you, Sophie. Sophie nodded, grateful for his presence despite the trouble it might cause him. She followed Max to Buddy's room, where she had a moment alone with her beloved pet. Buddy's tail wagged weakly at her approach, and Sophie felt her heart breaking all over again. I'm not giving up on you, Buddy, she whispered, stroking his fur gently. We're gonna get through this, I promise. Unknown to Sophie, Richard stood in the hallway, watching the tender scene unfold. His face, usually set in stern lines, softened for a moment, a conflict evident in his eyes. The moment was shattered by a sudden, harsh beeping from Buddy's monitor. Sophie's head snapped up, panic flooding her system. "Max!" she called out, her voice shrill with fear. As medical staff rushed into the room, Sophie found herself being ushered out. She caught a glimpse of Max, his face set in determination as he moved to help, despite his suspension. The doors closed, leaving Sophie in the hallway, her heart pounding in her ears. Minutes ticked by like hours. Sophie paced the corridor, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. When Max finally emerged, his expression was grave. "Sophie," he began, his voice gentle. "Buddy's condition is critical. We've stabilized him for now, but..." He trailed off, searching for the right words. Sophie felt the weight of the world crashing down on her shoulders. She looked at Max, tears welling in her eyes. The words she never thought she'd say formed on her lips, each one feeling like a betrayal to Buddy. "Maybe it's time to consider euthanasia," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. Sophie's heart sank as she uttered the words she never thought she'd have to consider. "Maybe it's time to think about euthanasia?" The weight of her statement hung heavy in the air, the silence broken only by the rhythmic beeping of Buddy's monitors. Max's eyes widened in disbelief. He shook his head vehemently. "No, Sophie. We can't give up on Buddy now. We've come too far." His voice cracked with emotion, betraying the professional demeanor he'd been trying to maintain. Sophie closed her eyes, fighting back tears. Memories of Buddy flooded her mind. His wagging tail when she came home from work, his comforting presence during lonely nights, the way he seemed to sense when she was sad and would rest his head on her lap. Each moment was a reminder of the bond they shared, a bond she wasn't ready to sever. "I don't want to," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I don't know what else to do. We're running out of time, money, and options." Max placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Let's not make any decisions yet. We still have a little time left." As if on cue, Dr. Foster appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I may have a solution," he said, stepping into the room. Both Sophie and Max looked up, a glimmer of hope in their eyes. Dr. Foster cleared his throat. "I've been reviewing Buddy's case, and I believe I can buy us some more time with an experimental treatment. It's risky, but it could stabilize him enough for the surgery." Sophie's heart raced. "You do that? But what about the hospital's policies?" "Sometimes we need to remember why we became doctors in the first place," Dr. Foster replied, a hint of defiance in his voice. However, their moment of hope was short-lived. As Dr. Foster began explaining the procedure, a stern voice interrupted from the hallway. "Dr. Foster, a word, please." The hospital administrator, a tall woman with a severe expression, stood in the doorway. Dr. Foster's shoulders slumped as he followed her out of the room. Sophie and Max exchanged worried glances, straining to hear the heated discussion taking place just outside. Fragments of the conversation drifted in: liability issues, unauthorized procedures, breach of protocol. When Dr. Foster returned, his face was grim. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "The administration has forbidden me from proceeding with the treatment. They believe the risks are too high." Sophie felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. She stumbled back, steadying herself against the wall. "So, that's it? We just let Buddy die?" Max, his jaw set in determination, spoke up. "No, we don't. I'll talk to my father one more time. Maybe I can convince him Dash." His words were cut short by the sudden arrival of Brianna, who burst into the room, breathless and excited. "Sophie, I think I found a potential big donor. They're interested in Buddy's story and Dash." The hope that flared in Sophie's chest was extinguished just as quickly by the shrill sound of alarms blaring from Buddy's monitors. The dog's body began to convulse, his eyes rolling back. "He's going into cardiac arrest," Max shouted, immediately rushing to Buddy's side. The room erupted into chaos. Medical staff flooded in, pushing Sophie and Brianna aside. Sophie watched in horror as they began chest compressions on Buddy's small, fragile body. "No, no, no," Sophie chanted, tears streaming down her face. She felt Max's arms wrap around her, holding her back as she instinctively tried to rush to Buddy. Dr. Foster appeared, pushing his way through the crowd. "Move aside," he commanded, taking charge of the situation despite the earlier warnings. Sophie buried her face in Max's chest, unable to watch as Dr. Foster and the team worked tirelessly to revive Buddy. The seconds stretched into eternity, each moment punctuated by the flat tone of the heart monitor. And then miraculously, a beep, followed by another, and another. "We've got him back," Dr. Foster announced, his voice thick with relief. Sophie's knees buckled, and Max tightened his grip to keep her upright. Buddy was alive, but his condition remained critical. The monitors showed a weak, erratic heartbeat. As the medical team stabilized Buddy, Dr. Foster turned to face Sophie and Max. The lines on his face seemed deeper, etched with the strain of the past few minutes. His eyes, however, held a mixture of determination and grave concern. "We managed to bring him back," Dr. Foster said, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation of the severity of the situation. "But without the surgery in the next 12 hours, there won't be another chance." The words hung in the air, a final ultimatum from fate itself. Sophie felt the weight of them settle on her shoulders, the ticking clock now louder than ever in her mind. Max squeezed her hand, a silent promise that he wouldn't give up. Brianna stood nearby, her earlier news of a potential donor now feeling like a lifeline they desperately needed to grasp. As they stood there, watching Buddy's fragile form on the bed, surrounded by machines keeping him alive, Sophie realized that the next few hours would determine everything. It was a race against time, against bureaucracy, against the very forces of nature that threatened to take Buddy away. But looking at the determined faces around her, Max's unwavering support, Dr. Foster's defiant compassion, Brianna's fierce loyalty, Sophie found a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed. They had come too far to give up now. With renewed resolve, Sophie turned to Max, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with steely determination. "We're not losing him. Not now, not ever." Dr. Foster turned to Sophie and Max, his expression grave. "We managed to bring him back, but without the surgery in the next 12 hours, there won't be another chance." Brianna burst into the waiting room, her eyes wide with excitement, and her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Sophie and Max looked up from their somber conversation, startled by her sudden entrance. "You guys won't believe this," Brianna exclaimed, breathless. "The story has gone viral on Pet Lovers United." Sophie and Max exchanged confused glances before turning their attention back to Brianna. She thrust her phone in front of them, showing a screen filled with likes, shares, and comments. "Look at this. The post about Buddy has been shared over 10,000 times in the last hour alone. People are going crazy over his story." Sophie took the phone with trembling hands, her eyes widening as she scrolled through the flood of supportive messages and pledges of donations. Max leaned in close, his shoulder brushing against hers as he read along. "This is incredible," Sophie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As if on cue, Sophie's phone began to buzz incessantly. Notifications poured in, each one representing a new donation to Buddy's campaign. The numbers were climbing rapidly, far faster than they had in the past week combined. Max refreshed the campaign page, his jaw dropping as he saw the total. "Sophie, look at this. We're already halfway to the goal, and it's still going up." Outside the hospital, a commotion began to build. Through the waiting room windows, they could see a small crowd gathering, many holding signs with Buddy's picture and messages of support. Among them were several people with cameras and microphones. "Are those reporters?" Sophie asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and hope. Before anyone could answer, Richard burst into the waiting room, his face a mask of barely contained panic. "What in the world is going on out there? There are journalists asking for statements about some dog named Buddy." Max stood up, squaring his shoulders as he faced his father. "That would be the dog you've been trying to turn away, Dad. The one whose story has apparently touched the hearts of thousands of people." Richard's face flushed red, a vein pulsing in his forehead. He stormed out of the waiting room and towards the hospital entrance, clearly intent on damage control. Sophie, Max, and Brianna followed close behind, curious to see how he would handle the situation. As Richard stepped outside, camera flashes erupted, and a chorus of questions assaulted him. He raised his hands, calling for quiet, and began to make a statement about the hospital's policies and the complexities of Buddy's case. But his words were soon drowned out by a stronger voice. Dr. Foster pushed through the crowd, his white coat billowing behind him like a cape. "I can no longer stand by and watch as this hospital turns its back on those in need," Dr. Foster announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. Buddy's case is not just about one dog. It's about compassion, about doing what's right even when it's difficult. The crowd cheered, and more cameras turned to focus on Dr. Foster. Richard attempted to interject, but his voice was lost in the swell of support for the senior veterinarian's words. Sensing an opportunity, Brianna gently nudged Sophie forward. "Tell them your story," she whispered. "Let them hear it from you." With a deep breath, Sophie stepped up beside Dr. Foster. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she recounted her journey with Buddy, from finding him abandoned on the streets to the current fight for his life. Tears glistened in her eyes, but her words were clear and heartfelt. As Sophie spoke, Max confronted his father away from the cameras. "Do you see now, Dad? This is bigger than hospital policies or profit margins. This is about saving a life and doing what's right." Richard's stern expression faltered as he watched the growing crowd, heard the impassioned pleas, and saw the determination in his son's eyes. For the first time, doubt crept into his features. Inside the hospital, Buddy's campaign page continued to light up with activity. Celebrities and social media influencers had picked up on the story, sharing it with their millions of followers. The hospital's phone lines were jammed with calls from people offering support or asking how they could help. Sophie and Max shared a look of cautious optimism as they watched the donation total climb ever closer to their goal. The atmosphere in the hospital had shifted dramatically, from one of despair to one of hope. Dr. Foster approached them, a glimmer of excitement in his eyes. "I think I have a plan," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If we can secure the funding in the next few hours, I believe we can still save Buddy." As if in answer to his words, Brianna let out a whoop of joy. "We did it," she cried, holding up her phone. "We hit the goal, and it's still going up." The waiting room erupted in cheers. Nurses, other patients, and even some of the administrative staff who had gathered to watch the unfolding events joined in the celebration. Richard, who had retreated back inside, watched the scene unfold. The rigid set of his shoulders slowly relaxed, and something akin to admiration flickered in his eyes as he observed his son comforting an overwhelmed Sophie. With a deep sigh, Richard approached the group. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the hospital owner. He cleared his throat, looking directly at Max and Sophie. "It seems I've been short-sighted," Richard admitted, his voice gruff but sincere. "In light of recent events and the overwhelming public support, I'm authorizing Buddy's surgery to proceed immediately." A fresh wave of cheers washed over the room. Sophie sagged against Max in relief, tears streaming down her face. Max wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. As the excitement of the moment began to ebb, reality set in. Buddy was about to undergo a critical, life-saving surgery. The path ahead was still uncertain and fraught with potential complications. Sophie clutched Max's hand tightly as they watched the medical team prepare to take Buddy into surgery. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if it's not enough?" The bustling hospital corridor fell silent as Buddy was wheeled towards the operating room. Sophie's eyes welled up with tears as she leaned down to kiss her beloved dog's forehead one last time before the surgery. "You can do this, Buddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll be right here waiting for you." As the doors to the operating room swung open, Max appeared, still in his street clothes, but with a determined look in his eyes. "I'm coming in," he announced to the surprised surgical team. Dr. Foster, already scrubbed and gowned, raised an eyebrow. "Max, you're not authorized," he began, but Max cut him off. "I don't care. I've been with Buddy from the start, and I'm seeing this through. You can throw me out afterward if you want, but right now, Buddy needs all the help he can get." After a moment's hesitation, Dr. Foster nodded. Scrub in. Quickly. As Max rushed to prepare, Sophie and Brianna made their way to the waiting room. Sophie's legs felt like lead as she sank into an uncomfortable plastic chair. Brianna sat beside her, clutching both their phones. Look, Brianna said softly, showing Sophie her screen. Messages are pouring in from all over the world. People are rooting for Buddy. Sophie managed a weak smile as she scrolled through the outpouring of support. Photos of pets, words of encouragement, and even promises of prayers filled the feed. It was overwhelming and heartwarming all at once. Inside the operating room, the tension was palpable as Dr. Foster made the first incision. Max stood at attention, ready to assist. The monitors beeped steadily, tracking Buddy's vital signs. Hours ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity to Sophie in the waiting room. She alternated between pacing nervously and sitting with her head in her hands, Buddy's favorite chew toy clutched tightly to her chest. Suddenly, alarms blared from the operating room. Inside, Dr. Foster's brow furrowed as he barked orders to the team. Blood pressure's dropping. We need to stabilize him now. Max sprang into action, his hands steady as he worked alongside the experienced surgeon. From the observation gallery, Richard watched in silence, his expression unreadable as he observed his son's skill and dedication. We're losing him, one of the nurses called out, panic edging into her voice. Dr. Foster and Max locked eyes across the operating table. In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They would not let Buddy go without a fight. Max, I need you to, Dr. Foster began, but Max was already moving, anticipating the surgeon's needs. For the next hour, the two worked in perfect synchronization, their movements fluid and precise. The rest of the team watched in awe as they navigated complication after complication. In the waiting room, Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't explain it, but somehow she knew Buddy was in trouble. Closing her eyes, she began to pray silently, her lips moving in a desperate whisper. Please, 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 she repeated like a mantra. Don't take him from me. As if in answer to her prayers, the alarms in the operating room suddenly quieted. The tension in the air began to dissipate as Buddy's vitals stabilized. Dr. Foster straightened up, allowing himself a small sigh of relief. We're not out of the woods yet, he cautioned, but I think we've turned a corner. The surgery entered its final hours. The team was exhausted, but their determination never wavered. Max's hands moved with a confidence that belied his years, impressing even the most experienced nurses in the room. As they approached the final sutures, a hush fell over the operating room. Buddy's heart rate, which had been steady for the past hour, suddenly faltered. No, 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 Max muttered, his eyes fixed on the monitor. Come on, Buddy, you're so close. For several agonizing seconds, the only sound in the room was the erratic beeping of the heart monitor. Sophie, sensing the critical moment even from the waiting room, clutched Buddy's toy tighter, her knuckles turning white. And then, as if Buddy had heard their collective plea, the monitor's beeping evened out. A strong, steady rhythm filled the room. Dr. Foster let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. We did it, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. Buddy's going to make it. A cheer erupted from the surgical team. Max felt tears of relief stinging his eyes as he looked down at Buddy, now peacefully unconscious and on the road to recovery. In the waiting room, Dr. Foster's assistant approached Sophie and Brianna. The surgery was successful, she announced with a smile. Buddy made it through. Sophie burst into tears, this time from joy and relief. Brianna hugged her tightly, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. As the team began the post-operation procedures, the door to the operating room swung open. Richard entered, his face a mask of seriousness. Max, he said, his voice cutting through the celebratory atmosphere. We need to talk. Now. Sophie's heart raced as she approached Buddy's recovery room. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, and now, finally, she would see her beloved companion after his life-saving surgery. As she entered, her eyes immediately locked onto Buddy's. His tail wagged weakly, but his eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, buddy," Sophie choked out, rushing to his side. She gently stroked his head, careful of the various tubes and monitors still attached to him. "You did it, boy. You're so brave." Tears of joy and relief streamed down her face as Buddy nuzzled her hand. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of the hospital, Max stood face to face with his father, Richard. The tension between them was palpable, but there was something different in Richard's eyes, a mix of pride and uncertainty. "Son," Richard began, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "what you did, it was reckless, against protocol, and could have cost us everything." Max braced himself for the worst, but Richard continued, "It was also incredibly brave and compassionate. You reminded me of why I got into this business in the first place." Max was speechless. His father's words were the last thing he expected to hear. As they continued to talk, years of misunderstanding and tension began to melt away, replaced by a newfound respect and understanding between father and son. The following day, Dr. Foster called a staff meeting. The veteran veterinarian looked around the room, his gaze lingering on Max before addressing everyone. "After much consideration, I've decided it's time for me to retire," he announced. A collective gasp filled the room. "But before I go, I want to acknowledge the exceptional dedication and skill demonstrated by Dr. Max Carter. His actions, while unconventional, saved a life and reminded us all of the true purpose of our profession." As the news of Dr. Foster's retirement spread, more surprises were in store. Sophie received an unexpected phone call from one of the campaign's major donors, a successful tech entrepreneur who had been moved by her story. "We need someone with your passion and determination in our animal welfare division," the donor explained, offering Sophie a job that aligned perfectly with her love for animals. Inspired by the events surrounding Buddy's case, Richard announced the implementation of a new social veterinary care program at the hospital. The program aimed to provide affordable care to pet owners in financial distress, ensuring that no animal would be turned away due to lack of funds. With these changes came a shift in Max's role at the hospital. Richard, recognizing his son's talent and compassion, granted Max greater autonomy and responsibility, particularly in overseeing the new social care program. As Buddy continued to recover, Sophie found herself spending more time at the hospital, not just for her furry friend, but also drawn to Max's company. One evening, as they walked through the quiet halls after visiting hours, Max gently took Sophie's hand. They paused, looking at each other with a mix of nervousness and excitement, both realizing that their shared ordeal had blossomed into something more. To celebrate Buddy's recovery and thank everyone involved, Brianna organized a heartwarming gathering at a local park. Supporters, hospital staff, and even some of the online donors who lived nearby attended. The air was filled with laughter, barks, and the unmistakable feeling of community. Richard, who had been notably absent from such events in the past, surprised everyone by taking the microphone. "I owe all of you, and especially my son, an apology," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "This experience has opened my eyes to the true meaning of compassion in our field. I promise you, changes are coming to ensure we never lose sight of that again." As the party continued, Buddy took his first post-surgery walk in the park, surrounded by a crowd of well-wishers. Sophie couldn't help but beam with pride as her once critical pet trotted along, tail wagging happily. Later that week, Sophie visited her old workplace to tie up loose ends and say goodbye to her former colleagues. What had once felt like a setback now seemed like a blessing in disguise, leading her to a career path she had always dreamed of but never thought possible. Back at the hospital, Max approached Sophie with an exciting proposition. "How would you like to partner with me in managing the new social program?" he asked, eyes twinkling. "Your experience and passion would be invaluable." Sophie's face lit up at the prospect of working alongside Max and continuing to make a difference in animals' lives. "I'd love to," she replied, squeezing his hand. As they discussed their plans, Dr. Foster walked by, overhearing their conversation. With a mischievous grin, he quipped, "You know, sometimes miracles happen when you break just the right rules." They all laughed, acknowledging the truth in his words. Over the next few weeks, Buddy's recovery progressed rapidly. Sophie watched in awe as her furry friend regained his strength and playful spirit. From those first tentative steps in the hospital to chasing squirrels in the backyard, Buddy's journey was a testament to the power of love, determination, and community. The story of Buddy's miraculous recovery had not only changed the lives of Sophie and Max, but had also sparked a movement within the veterinary community. Other hospitals began implementing similar programs, inspired by their story. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, Sophie and Max took Buddy to the park for a well-deserved play session. As they watched him bound across the grass, chasing a frisbee with the energy of a much younger dog, they couldn't help but reflect on how far they had all come. Sophie leaned into Max, their fingers intertwined, a sense of contentment washing over them. Buddy returned, dropping the frisbee at their feet and looking up expectantly, his tail wagging furiously. Max turned to Sophie, a playful smile on his face. "So," he said, squeezing her hand gently, "what's our next adventure going to be?"